half. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Roger Waldinger. I'm professor of sociology, director of the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's event. This session, as with all of the events that we have organized over the past 2 academic years, is held in conjunction with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to remind you that we have one more event scheduled for the academic year, and that'll take place 2 weeks from today on June 3rd. And it will involve Adrian Favell, who is a professor of sociology at Leeds University in the UK, who will talk about his brand new book, The Integration Nation, Immigration and Colonial Power in Liberal Democracies, followed by a comment from Sarah Wallace Goodman, who is professor of political science at UC Irvine. Okay, so without any further ado, I want to introduce today's session. So this is the third in a series of workshops that have been organized by the various immigration research centers scattered throughout the UC system. And the motivation has been to, in a way, respond to the circumstances of the past 2 years to provide a different way of introducing, in particular, younger researchers to the broad range of migration-related methodologies. And so today's session is going to focus on government data in migration research, advantage, pitfalls, and examples. And we're delighted to have 3 speakers, Austin Kocher of the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse at Syracuse University, Caitlin Patler, Department of Sociology, UC Davis, and Alicia Riley, Department of Sociology, UC Santa Cruz. So the speakers will proceed in that order. We're going to postpone all substantive discussion until all 3 speakers have concluded. However, if you have questions of information or clarification, please send them in the text and I'll convey them to the speaker. So without further ado, Austin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introductions. Can everyone hear me and see the screen that I've shared? Is that working for us?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So yeah, my name is Austin Kocher. I'm a TRAC at Syracuse University. Some of you who are already in the immigration space may be familiar with our work because TRAC has been around for a little bit more than 30 years, using freedom of information requests and litigation to get data, records from the federal government. We get data from a lot of different areas, but immigration is our sort of biggest area. I am myself a social scientist by training, a geographer, and my work over the past 10, 11 years has focused on, just my career, has focused on the immigration enforcement system in the United States. So I study everything from the first contact that someone has with a law enforcement officer of some kind, all the way through the end of that process from, immigration enforcement, detention, the immigration court system, and whatever comes after. So I joined TRAC a few years ago because, and I'll explain a little bit more about, obviously, about how TRAC works, but because I'm really interested in sort of piecing together as complete of a picture of the immigration enforcement system as possible, using both, primarily my work is sort of theoretical and qualitative in terms of understanding, ethnographically how law enforcement agencies work, how race plays into enforcement and policing, and sort of trying to think about how immigration enforcement is remaking, social categories and the nation state as kind of an apparatus as a larger question. But of course, today's talk will be a little bit more focused on the data side of that work, because data, as it turns out, is really, really important to making sense of that system, especially data that the government has. So I'll kind of get into that here. So I want to start with just a couple of conceptual notes, and I really want to start with Even though TRAC collects, and as the title says, we get 4 billion records a year. They're digital records. It's not like we're processing paper, but we get a lot of records and we manage that. And again, I'll talk about how we do that. But one of the things that I run into on a frequent, really a daily basis, is sort of the effects of how we think about data, and government data in particular play a really big role in how people use the data and what people are looking for when they come to TRAC or they come to government data sets and try to make sense of them. So I want to start with a kind of intimidating graphic of what, at least a couple of years ago, is a conceptual database diagram of all of the databases that Immigration and Customs Enforcement uses to do their work. It's a really enormous and very complicated system. As you can see, the enforcement integrated database is in the center. It's sort of the the big kahuna of databases here, the EID, but it's tied in with a whole bunch of other data. And this is not like data that sits in like a filing cabinet somewhere where you file a piece of paper away. This data is all live. It's constantly changing. It's constantly fluctuating. There's a lot of inputs. Staff people throughout the Department of Homeland Security has access to this. Staff people at the Department of Homeland Security also in the last couple of years have had access to the immigration court database too, which you don't see here. But it's these are really massive databases. And before I get into the details of how we do the work, I think it's really important to think about the ways in which databases have come to structure social existence and state power in some really important ways, really structure how we think about the world. And sort of the key takeaway here is, I don't want you to think of this diagram as something where that like raw data is simply getting fed into and stored, but actually this is what we're looking at as a diagram of power. Not every single possible data point is being collected. Certain data points are being collected and being used in very strategic and intentional and sometimes even unintentional ways. So to that end, I want to draw from this fantastic book, Blockchain Chicken Farm, by Xiaowei Wang, that came out last year, earlier this year. Really great book that really examines the uses of data in sort of our sort of modern global economy. And what she says at one point is, to think about the collection of data and the design of databases, these are intentional. And the dimensions of data that need to be collected and defined already imbue a vision of how a world should be turned granular. Essentially, she's describing the datafication of our world through databases. So databases are designed to capture some things and not others. They're built with a certain vision of the world that makes some things possible and some things impossible to look at. Different databases have different logics for the way data must be formatted, which again, in turn, shapes the way that we've come to encode the world. So databases actually do things in the world and make selections. They're not repositories of objective data. Rob Kitchen, a fellow geographer of mine, has done some really great work on data ontologies, which is a way to think about the fact that data is not produced in a vacuum, but that there are socio-technical conditions that undergird the harvesting, analysis, and circulation of data. And especially on the fact that data is what's captured in ICE databases, like any database, is a selection of the sum of possible things that we could be collecting. And so it makes, it sort of draws our attention to some things and makes some things possible to think about, while things that aren't collected and aren't sort of digitized and datafied, so we sort of lose track of those things. And it's very important to think about that when we're thinking about how immigration systems work and what we can sort of examine objectively. And so one of the distinctions that Rob Kitchen makes, I think it's very important just to plug, is that is this idea that we use the word data to describe quantitative data that's inside these data sets, but actually we should be calling them capta. The difference being that data has historically been used as things that are there, given facts that are known, whereas capta actually historically meant things that are taken, things that are actually, there's intentionality there, there's selectivity. So I sometimes like to think about that we aren't looking at databases, we're looking at capta bases, we're looking at selections of data. And so in doing so, I think to sort of conceptualize government data sets and databases in the context of sort of political theory, and to think about the fact that historically states have had a monopoly on the use of force, but increasingly states also have a kind of monopoly on the control and uses of data and the production of knowledge around, in our case, immigration enforcement. So with that sort of being said, and I'll come back to that will have implications in the talk, I want to sort of move then to how TRAC works and how TRAC does the work that it does. So as I mentioned, TRAC obtains data from databases like those that are managed by the Department of Homeland Security, as well as other government agencies. First of all, by filing Freedom of Information Act requests and often litigating. One of the things that comes up in government transparency work is very often, if you really want to get the data and the records that that you want for transparency purposes, litigation is often very important. As you'll see, we get those records, then we have to do a lot of detective work to make sense of them. We employ some really rigorous validation methods along the way. So we don't just get things and put it out to the public. We make sure that it's right. We make sure that the data was, extracted from the government databases properly, that they didn't make mistakes along the way. And we also make sure that we understand what we're putting out into the world, because there can also be a lot of harm. There's a lot of conversation right now around data harm that can happen when people sort of disclose data and use data in irresponsible ways. And then we make that data, as you'll see, available through reports. We do all kinds of in-depth analysis on immigration data, and we also make that data available through interactive tools where people can go online and look at the data yourself and take from it, what you're interested in, whether you're a reporter or a researcher or just the public, trying to understand the immigration world better. So a couple key points about the data. So the data we get is very often not intended for the public to see. When we think about the databases that I just sort of showed a second ago, we're asking for them to pull out data, but it's not as if government officers were plugging in data into those databases in order to provide it to the public. Not all data that is in databases necessarily designed for reporting purposes or designed for the public to see. That doesn't prevent us from asking records and getting records under transparency law, but that's a really important thing. And so sometimes the fact that the data was not designed for public reporting means that we get insight into how agencies work that they didn't necessarily want us to understand. But on the other hand, on the less nefarious side of that, you might say, the data is just not designed for reporting. So it's kind of messier and more complicated than sometimes people are sort of prepared to think about. It also doesn't come with a manual or tech support, so we have to do the research to make sense of it. There's not like a hotline we can call and ask them questions. I mean, they often didn't want to give us the data in the first place. And the other really key thing here is that we have very long-term vision. We don't do anything that we can't keep up for 5 or 10 years or longer, because it takes a long time to get really good data. It often requires years of effort and strategy and litigation. We have a case that we're trying to wrap up now in the New York District Court that basically the start of this case was 12 years ago. It started with a FOIA that we submitted in 2010. So, I mean, that's 12 years to get data. This isn't something that moves very quickly. Okay, oops, I didn't do that right. So let me kind of show you the process that we have here. So when we send FOIA requests out, eventually, not always very quickly, but eventually we will get data back in, let's say, an Excel spreadsheet like this. This is fine if you're getting a single data set, but very often we're not asking for like just a couple hundred records or just a very specific thing. We're asking for a lot of data. And so even when it comes in Excel spreadsheets, we're not able to store and reliably validate and process data in a sort of desktop version like this. We feed this into our servers here at Syracuse University. We use command line SAS server technology to basically read it in as SAS data sets into these massive databases. And that's how, this is how we're able to manage 4 billion records a year, is through automation and leveraging technology to make this work. And then in addition to, the, getting data in spreadsheets and reading it in, a lot of my work is all of the human labor that goes into making sense of the data. So, for instance, in the immigration court data, which is sort of our best data set at this point, there's just a lot of codes in there that go into any database that we have to spend a lot of effort making sense of so that we can report on it. So, if you're familiar with the immigration deportation process, there are about 1.8, 1.9 million people right now in the United States facing deportation in the immigration court system. That's a lot of people. We're closing in on 2 million people. And so even within that immigration court system, you might think, oh, well, these people are just facing deportation. That must be pretty simple. Well, actually, there's all kinds of different case types in the immigration court proceedings. It's very, very technical. And it takes a lot of human work to make sense of it. And I'm showing you one of my, that piece of paper there is actually a really big piece of paper. So this was like a full week of work to make sense of all of these EOIR decision codes so that we understood the different contingencies and what was happening so that we could write responsibly about it. And to make that happen, it takes, legal research, it takes a lot of qualitative work. And that's sort of why, to go back to that initial, my orientation to this work, this is not work that you can do just by like running some fancy statistics. It actually, getting this data and making use of this data takes a lot of human labor and actually a really detailed understanding of how these systems work in practice. So I'll show you a couple examples of how it's kind of what we do with this data and the kind of issues that we run into as we're going through it. So I'll start with some data that is actually public. Immigration and Customs Enforcement about 2 years ago was required by Congress to start releasing data on immigrant detention on more or less a biweekly basis. They were supposed to have this data out this week. They did not, so they're running late. So we hope we'll get our most recent data this month. But this is data that you can go see. We didn't file a FOIA request for this. Any of you can go and look at this. It's on ICE's detention management page. If you go to their detention management page, scroll down, you'll see about 2/3 of the way down a little file for ICE statistics. Now, you wouldn't know it just looking at it, but this link actually gets updated like I said, every 2 weeks, give or take. And if you click on it, what you'll get is this spreadsheet of detention data. It's got a typical Excel spreadsheet, bunch of tabs at the bottom, and all kinds of interesting detention statistics here. Now, a couple things we run into with this data. First, as you can see this week, they don't always publish it quite as regularly as they should. So one of the ways that we leverage technology is we actually have a script that goes to the website and checks to see if that file has been updated, when it was updated, what the current date of the file is. Now, we could do that, manually, but because we leverage technology, we're able to build a script into that. And then I just get an email alert when there's a new file added, and then I know to go and look at it. We also validate it. And so because over the last 2 years, I've gotten really familiar with what this data looks like, I kind of know what to look for in terms of seeing, okay, when they added the new file, is it actually reliable? Did they mess up the data? That kind of thing. One thing that's been really interesting to me and important to me is looking at alternatives to detention data. So this is, one of the things that we've seen is a massive growth in the number of immigrants being monitored by GPS ankle monitors or monitored through their smartphone on a new thing called SmartLink, which ICE has been using a whole lot since the start of the Biden administration. So I've been tracking that, and we go in and we have a look at that data every time it's updated. But one of the things that's really important here too is from the public transparency perspective, when they update that file on their website, they don't keep old files. So it's not like you can go in there and see what the data was at any point in the past. You have to get the new file and download it and save it. One of the things that we try to do to add value to the transparency community and to journalists and researchers is we download that file, we validate it, and then we keep it, and we make all of that data available to the public so that you can go in on our website and actually look at the data for yourself and, and write about it or do something interesting with it. So all of that data I just showed you on detention facilities, alternatives to detention data, all this stuff, we've taken that and turned that into what we hope is a pretty easy to use tool that we call Immigration Detention Quick Facts. So this is a way for us to actually say, okay, if you look at all this data in a spreadsheet, most people are not going to have the time or the interest or maybe the knowledge base to make sense of it and to track it over time, nor should you necessarily have to do that. But we do, and because we do that, we try to provide, okay, here's some snapshots of the most important things. How many people are in detention? How many have a criminal record? Which states have the most detainees? That kind of thing, that we think that most people, if they're trying to keep up with the immigration system, are going to find the most interesting and relevant. And we find that reporters use this a lot. We also make the underlying tables available. So remember how I said they don't keep the old files over time. Well, you can click through on our little click here to see more data thing. You can go in and see, oh, here's all of the data since they started releasing this. We make that available so people can go in and track things over time, which isn't necessarily available if you didn't have someone doing this. Same with alternatives to detention data down here. This has become a really big deal recently. I don't know how familiar everyone is on the call with the immigration system and with alternatives to detention. But because we've been tracking this and making this available, a lot of reporters and policy makers and analysts have been using this data. And of course, we've also written on this. I wrote on this, I think it's been 2 months ago, 3 months ago, on the massive growth of alternatives to detention under the Biden administration. So this is how I'm kind of showing you from start to finish how we start with raw data and move all the way to having some kind of impact. Now, again, this data is just a subset, very small subset of everything that ICE has. So we do a lot more complicated FOIA requests and work with more complicated data sets than just the detention data. So I wanted to show you as my second of 2 examples what we're doing with that. So our sort of second case study of what TRAC does is our immigration court data. As I mentioned, our immigration court data is the best data that we have for immigration. And the reason it's so good is that we won a very effective case, ultimately a very effective and useful case in federal court, suing the Department of Justice to obtain access to the immigration court data, which now we get every single month. We think that data is really valuable because it allows us to track on a monthly basis on a very granular level how many people are put into deportation proceedings each month. And then we're able to look at nationality. We're able to look at which immigration court someone's at. We're able to look at, we did some recent analysis. We added a whole bunch of information, which we hope is relevant. We added language. You can now go in and see, how many people speak indigenous languages, how many people speak Spanish, how many people speak, let's say, French or other languages from around the world, Chinese, so forth. Citizenship or nationalities status, if they've been detained. So we have information on whether or not someone has been detained so far. And then probably one of the things that gets used the most by the public is our asylum data. The US government puts a lot of people who are facing asylum into the deportation process. And so one of the things that we do is we sort of track and see, well, what are rates of asylum? How successful are asylum seekers who are coming to the United States? And how does that vary from, over time? How many people are applying for asylum? What rate are people getting approved for asylum? How does that vary from judge to judge, from court to court, or from nationality to nationality? Chinese nationals have a much higher success rate of asylum than, say, Haitian asylum seekers or something like that, which I think raises, this is not an easy question to answer, but it raises questions about how race plays into the immigration system, of course. The immigration courts, like ICE, do not have race data. I've been having some conversations with folks at another conference yesterday and today about race in the immigration system. So it's not easy to answer with this data, but it does at least suggest some ways to get at that. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how we work. Now, I just want to highlight, I'm actually going to skip over this part and just get to some of the impacts. I'm just looking at time. I did want to note, maybe just quickly, one of the, in addition to providing the public with this important data, one of the things that we're able to do is really examine issues that come up. So if the government is making mistakes in data, and one of the things that we found 2 years ago during the Trump administration, although not necessarily directly because of President Trump, other more complicated than that. But we found that the immigration courts had some major data issues at the agency. And we were able to flag that because we look at that data over time. And so, you know, when issues come up in the data, we're able to flag those pretty early. Like I said, I'm going to skip over this. The last piece I just want to point out here is that we also get to do all kinds of fun things. I worked with some students, journalism students here at Syracuse University, to take that data that we have. You know, we're a very technical institute, and the website isn't the most, you know, it's not like the flashiest website you've ever seen, but we do try to take that data and make it accessible. And so, you know, we got to work with some students to redesign the asylum data and, you know, look at court by court, you know, how many cases were denied. So this was kind of a fun project. And we hope that by doing this, you know, we kind of make the data a bit more accessible. I work a lot with journalists. So this is something I worked with Mother Jones magazine on about a year and a half ago to produce, you know, to tie our data to some really concrete stories. As a geographer, I get to map this data, which is fun. I use GIS in my work to really look at, okay, let's look at the distribution of how many people are facing deportation. One interesting finding from this research was that actually, if you look at the highest per capita rate of people facing deportation, there's a lot of counties in the middle of the country where a larger percent of people are facing deportation than actually in the coasts. Smaller population size, of course, but a higher percent of immigrants facing deportation. So that's some of the work that we get to do. And, you know, we like to think that this makes a difference at the end of the day, because we do get, you know, we do have a pretty outsized impact on the national conversation, on the media. We get picked up. We tend to get picked up about 4,000 times a year. I can't remember what that works out to on a daily basis, but we're cited every day in public news media outlets, and also by academics across the country as well. So thanks so much for your time, and I'm excited to hear from my other panelists.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Austin. So now give the floor to Caitlin Patler.
Great. Let me just get my presentation going. Are we having that same screen issue, Alicia, as we did before? Okay. All right. For some reason, I have to set it up twice. Are we good?
Good.
Okay, great. So I just want to thank Roger and David for the invitation, and the various migration centers across the UC for co-sponsoring the event. It's really a pleasure to be in the company of such a vibrant and multidisciplinary group of scholars. So Roger and I had a conversation last fall about organizing this workshop. And as he mentioned in the beginning, we were interested in thinking through some options really for student research in this era in which the COVID-19 pandemic has altered some of the ways, the traditional ways that sociologists at least have done research, in particular archival research, qualitative methods that require in-person exchanges, and even secondary data analysis. There were a number of population surveys that were late on releasing data, et cetera, all kinds of issues. So my comments today are partially motivated by that conversation and an effort to introduce students to some perhaps less familiar ways of acquiring or accessing data on issues pertaining to migration. Austin didn't mention this, but TRAC has a fellows program, and I'm a fellow at TRAC, which you've just heard all about. And I've benefited tremendously from the data that they have available. And I use it in my research and in my teaching. And I just want to also plug TRAC by saying I've benefited from their expertise, their guidance, and really their kindness, their patience. I've heard Sue Long described as a saint on more than one occasion. So just appreciating deeply the work that you all do. You're doing the heavy lifting in the effort to make government data more transparent. But of course, you saw the work it takes. And so there's not always going to be data on everything. So what I want to do today is share a strategy that I have used just a little bit in my research. I'm probably better known for research on immigrant legal status and also on detention, but mostly using data from TRAC. But on a few occasions now, I have submitted my own FOIA request as an individual, as an academic, to DHS for data on various topics. And I will say before starting, again, this is sort of, my comments are sort of targeted to students. I see multiple people on this webinar who could give this talk with far more authority than I could. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert on FOIA, but I did want to share what I've learned in the process, because I did sort of come across this strategy of using FOIA to access data by accident. So let's see if I can get this to work. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to go over sort of what is FOIA in the first place for those who may not be familiar. Very briefly, I'll talk about that. What agencies can we submit to for migration data? You heard some of it from Austin. And then talk a little bit about what I did before submitting my FOIA requests to ICE. In particular, in my case, I submitted to ICE. I've also submitted to CBP. A couple of comments about making your request make sense. I think as social scientists, we are not used to lawyer speak. And so there are some strategies which, again, others on this webinar could talk about in much more detail, but there are some tips that I've learned over the years. And then just technical stuff, how to actually submit your request and check on the status of a request, and then two very brief examples from my work. So that's what I'm gonna do. So first, what is FOIA? It's often described, the Freedom of Information Act, it's often described as a law that, quote, keeps citizens in the know about their government. It's our way of being able to, it gives the public the right to request access to records from any federal agency, and they're required to disclose records under FOIA unless elements of those records or the records themselves fall under certain exemptions. And I'll show you in a little bit what an exemption looked like in the context of my research. Under DHS, which is probably where, as migration researchers, we would be looking for data, the Department of Homeland Security, that includes, among others, Customs and Border Patrol, so ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, Border Patrol, USCIS, which is Citizenship and Immigration Services, and several other compartments, basically, within the DHS. So you can submit to the DHS FOIA office for records from those agencies. So what to do before submitting a request? Well, the first thing, as always, is check TRAC. That's where I would always start, because FOIA is not easy. It's a lengthy process. It can be a bit of a labyrinth. It's confusing, and TRAC really, as you just heard, has probably the best set of records that are available. And I think I want to underscore something Austin said, which is that they have what's available, what has been recorded. And that I think there are a lot of open questions about what may not have been recorded, what is not recorded systematically, but they would have really the best quality data, and also just expertise on whether it's even worth asking for a certain thing. That's something I've benefited from as a fellow. You get a little more attention once you apply to be a fellow at TRAC, and you can get some feedback on what you're looking for. So first, check with TRAC, but in the event that TRAC doesn't have that data and it seems like a good idea to go ahead, then you want to get familiar with the process. So you can kind of see how DHS on their FOIA office page has, this step-by-step process that you should go through to assess, first assess whether you need to submit a FOIA, and then going through the request. And so you can get familiar with this website, I would say, is sort of helpful. It provides basic information, but it's interesting. Some of the links circle back to one another, and it really can be very confusing. One of the things they tell you, step number one, is search available records. And the different entities they're required to post on their website links to frequently requested statistics or data or information. And they do that, and they call it a library. But for those of us, I think most of us are part of academic institutions. We're used to libraries being a certain thing. I'm just going to show you an example of what this looks like for ICE. ICE's FOIA library. You can see basically they have a series of commonly requested data points or statistics, and you can click on any of these items and open it up, and you'll see different types of data under each of these, but this is their categorization of it and not necessarily yours or mine as a researcher. And there's no real better way to sort for it. So it's a library of sorts. It's also incomplete. I will say down toward the bottom of the page, there are logs of all FOIA requests submitted to ICE, or most FOIA requests, but they end at 2017. Oddly, maybe Austin has insight into that. I don't know why, but you can see sort of a set of, you can see the sets of the types of data that have been requested. And a lot of it is, lawyers requesting data on individual clients. So anyway, after you've done all this research, because you really want to avoid doing this if you can, but let's say you still can't find what you need and you decide to submit. So now it would be time to prepare your request. So I would say the first thing to do is start by looking at examples of the actual text of existing requests. And in a paper that I published in 2019, I actually included the request that I submitted with help from lawyers, which you'll hear about in a minute, as an appendix. It's not necessarily going to work for your particular research question or data interest, but it's just one example I'm putting out there that I'm happy to share. It's out there published and you can take a look. But in any case, there are required information by the FOIA office. You see the data points here that they require in any in your brief description of, in your FOIA request, it has to include each of these items. And I'll say a little bit about this description of records sought. Here is where I have learned by failing multiple times to be as specific as possible, as clear as possible, defining terms and parameters. This is obvious to the lawyers on this webinar. This is not obvious to the social scientists necessarily on this webinar. But just something like define the date range you're interested in, or if you're looking at a specific facility, be very clear. Those kinds of things. That's what I mean about defining, being specific, concise, and defining your parameters. In other words, you want to make it as easy as possible for them to pull records. As Austin mentioned, these are records that they are pulling that were not necessarily designed to be shared with the public. And so they're not organized in the way we want them to be, nearly ever. So being clear is important. And when possible, I also suggest getting a lawyer to look over your request. I love to bother my lawyer friends. They're like, oh no, here's Caitlin again with an email. This is especially important if you're in the position like I have been, where I had to appeal a denial and I didn't know what to do because I'm not a lawyer. So if you're someone that benefits from having a law school on your campus, there might be some resources available for that. All right, so when you're finally ready to submit, you submit through the ironically named PAL or public access portal, or you can send an email or even a snail mail request. But PAL is actually relatively easy to use. You have to create an account anyway in order to check the status. So that's what I've done. So that's where you check the status of your request. And speaking of which, under FOIA, agencies are supposed to release data within a very short period of time. They don't do that in this context. You would probably have to litigate to get the data more quickly. But just to share, in the two examples I'm going to talk about today are data that I requested on the use of solitary confinement, or what ICE calls administrative segregation, in detention facilities. And you can see here, the date that I submitted versus the date that I received the files. And I'm in my office today for the first time in a long time, and I was laughing because I actually found the CD that these files came on. It was a CD like this in a just a manila envelope, no padding, nothing. And so actually the first time I received my files, the CD was cracked in half and I couldn't use it. So I had to correspond with the FOIA office, get a new CD sent out to me, but finally did get the records. In the next case, I was looking for data at the national level, and it took quite a bit longer for ICE to respond to that request, about 9 months. I received what I'm saying here are partial files. I had complete records for all cases of solitary confinement that ICE defined as as administrative segregation. But they didn't include all the data points that I had requested. And so in this case, I did appeal on 3 counts, and I won my appeal on 2 counts, which you could have knocked me over with a feather when I actually succeeded in winning that. But I still am, the request was remanded for completion, but I'm still waiting for those records today. So in any case, my point here is this is not a fast process. So for students considering dissertations, you might sort of think about that and what data you actually need. But assuming you can get the data, terrific. Now it's time to analyze it. And so I'm just gonna, for the remainder of my comments, I'm gonna just share a little bit more about these 2 examples from my work. And so as I mentioned earlier, I started using FOIA kind of by accident through a longtime research practice partnership with a legal organization that was litigating on behalf of people who were held in ICE prisons in California. And so just a little background on this, probably not new for most people here today, but as you know, or many of you know, unlike in the criminal legal system, in immigration prisons, there are no systematic mechanisms for release. And most imprisoned immigrants who are held under mandatory detention statutes can be jailed indefinitely. Even though detention is not legally considered a punishment and people are not there serving sentences, they're awaiting a decision on their immigration legal proceedings. So advocates have fought for access to systematic mechanisms for release, like bond hearings in this context. And so from 2013 to 2015, I was part of a research practice partnership that I mentioned a minute ago to study those bond hearings. And in that process, what we did is we went into detention facilities and did in-person interviews and surveys with people who had been detained for long periods of time. And during those interviews with about 600 people, I heard a lot about some really terrible conditions of confinement, some of which have shown up in the news media, like you can see here on the slide. And I was particularly alarmed to hear from imprisoned people about their experiences being placed in solitary confinement. And I was alarmed for reasons that may be obvious. There's decades of research in the criminal legal context showing how harmful solitary confinement is for mental health and well-being for people who are confined. And it's an extremely punitive practice. I mean, just if you don't have to know anything about it to kind of imagine what solitary confinement is, 23 hours alone a day in a cell, 8x8 cell in a lot of cases, not always, but it's very punitive. And that's really inconsistent with the supposed definition of detention as an administrative holding process meant to ensure compliance with immigration laws. So, I was interested in understanding whether these things I was hearing about from these folks I was talking to in the detention facilities were, representative of what was happening overall in detention, but I couldn't find any academic research on the topic. So that's what motivated me to try to get the data myself. And specifically, I wanted to understand, these are very descriptive questions. I wanted to understand who is even put into solitary confinement in immigration prisons, what factors might influence ICE's stated reason for placing them there, and the length of time that they're held. So just basic descriptive questions, but we didn't have academic data on this. So I worked with lawyer colleagues to draft my FOIA request. And as I showed you a couple slides ago, I received the data about 5 months after submitting that initial request. And I got a spreadsheet, sort of like what Austin's look like. I'll show you an example of one excerpt. And here you can see what I was talking about when I said that ICE does. Sorry, I have my little Zoom thing over here. ICE does redact personally what they consider to be personally identifiable information. They then provided their binary definition of sex, male or female. You have the area of responsibility, which is the field office that sort of oversees any given facility, and the facility itself for this one record that I'm showing you as an example of 1,200 cases was Adelanto, which some of you are familiar with. You get some information, sometimes missing, on attorneys. and whether the person had an attorney and whether the attorney was notified of the placement into segregation. You get some information on their health status and profile, placement date and release date, allowing us to calculate length, an overall reason, and then a detailed reason. So I was also able to use these records to conduct an automated text analysis, and I actually read through them all myself, which was only possible because there were only 1,200. Like Austin was saying, at a certain point you have to automate this, and so I did. I read through them all, and then I automated it based on that task. And then there are additional comments about the release date, and I note that this person was not released after their 30 days, but because they were going to intake for removal or deportation. And then finally, we got this very interesting column of field officer comments, which were almost always just sort of rubber stamping the placements and hardly ever suggested any alternative to the confinement. So this is just one example. So it took me a while to get to these analyses. I sat on this CD for a long time. I was doing other research, but I finally, when I finally did, I was able to uncover some pretty alarming patterns. Let me get back over here, sorry. So first of all, we found, perhaps it won't be a surprise, but we found that ICE's stated reason for putting someone into confinement, as well as the total length of confinement, varied significantly across imprisoned people's background characteristics, including their mental illness status, which for us suggests that subcontractors are actually using solitary confinement to manage mental illness within facilities. And some people are nodding, and this is not a surprise because this is done and has been widely criticized in the criminal legal system as well. But if that's not problematic enough, we also found descriptive evidence in that text analysis of the onset or worsening of mental health illnesses once people were placed into solitary confinement. Alarmingly, we also found variation by field office jurisdiction and even individual facilities, which is a pretty big problem, again, in this system that supposedly has uniform federal guidelines for solitary confinement, for the use of what they call, again, administrative segregation. There are very clear reasons why someone, in theory, should be placed into confinement. These are supposed to be adhered to by any subcontractor. There are federal guidelines, and we found a lot of variation. So we sort of say that overall we exposed a black box, like a literal black box when you think about solitary confinement within a black box, which is this detention system where there's so little publicly available data on the actual internal operations. So this led me to wonder, okay, now this is what we're seeing in California during this specific period, what's going on in the rest of the country. So that was my second FOIA request. And this time when I submitted that FOIA request, I also requested additional information about country of origin. As Austin mentioned, ICE doesn't consistently keep track of data on race. And so, but I was interested in whether we might see some inconsistencies in the use of solitary confinement across populations, different populations within detention. And I also requested information on statuses, on the statuses of individuals that ICE considers vulnerable. So these are elderly people, people with limited English proficiency, et cetera, pregnant people. So when I say that the records were incomplete, it was because I did get the data on the country of origin. I did not get the data on the vulnerable statuses, and that's what's still pending. So ICE says, yes, we have that. We should give it to you. We should have given it to you, but I'm still waiting 4 years later, which I hope I'm not waiting 12 years. So for the analysis, so we did end up getting national records. I actually was able to compare the records I got with the records that a journalist had gotten, as well as records that a person from a government watchdog agency had gotten. And we were pleased to see that our records aligned one-to-one. That was, so if ICE is withholding information, it's at least withholding it in a systematic way. But I teamed up with Conrad Franco and Karamet Ryder to analyze about 8,500 records of solitary confinement during this time period. And what we did is we merged that data with TRAC data on facilities and on the sort of general characteristics of the detained population, including criminal history, to try to understand patterns of confinement and how they might vary across populations in ways that they shouldn't based on the distribution of the population more generally. And we found largely consistent results that were largely consistent with what we saw in California. But we also uncovered something new. And that is that there was a vast, and I'm talking an almost seven times over representation of immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean who were placed into solitary confinement. They were 25% of all of the cases compared to 4% of the total detained population. And we found that very, very troubling. And again, our results are suggesting that there is broad discretion at the very, very local decision-making level about who is placed into solitary confinement that we really shouldn't see based on these federal guidelines. And again, this does track with research on solitary confinement in the criminal legal context, but in that context, there's been a lot of activism around the issue of solitary confinement, and some real limitations on the practice have been put in place. But the same has been less true in the immigration context. So that's the bad news. So the good news is that there are a lot of advocates who are working on this and other issues around conditions of confinement and trying to eliminate the practice of incarceration in ICE in the immigration legal system more generally. They've been working hard to change this practice. And so what I'm really pleased with is that this work, which you notice again, is largely descriptive, it has been used in several ongoing litigation efforts to try to further protect the constitutional rights of imprisoned immigrants, even while working toward ending the system altogether. And I'm really proud that that work has been used in that way. All right, so that's just some of my adventures with FOIA, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have after we hear from Professor Riley. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. So thank you so much, Caitlin and Alicia. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Let me share my slides. Okay, so thank you so much for this opportunity to connect with you all and share ideas about using government data for migration research. I'm grateful to the organizers, and I also want to give a special thanks to Professor Juan Pedroza, who facilitated my participation in this panel. And I'm grateful to you all for attending, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later. So I thought I would organize my remarks in this order. I'm going to start by thinking about some of the motivating research questions that would draw on vital statistics data. And then I'll zoom through a rough intro to vital statistics for migration researchers. And this could be basic for some of you or even irrelevant for others, so I'll try to not keep it too long. I'll share two very brief examples from my own research, one that uses birth data, one that uses death data, and then I'll close with some brief takeaways and ideas for future research. So, oh, and I wanted to start my little timer here so I keep track of time. Okay, so what do vital statistics have to do with migration and immigration? I think some of the most interesting work sits at this intersection between migration studies and demography and social epidemiology. And so I'm going to come at this more from the social epidemiology angle, and we'll see if we can meet in the middle. There are long-standing epidemiologic observations that highlight seeming differences between the health of immigrants and the health of their native-born counterparts. And I say seeming differences because for some of the theories that I list here, such as the Hispanic mortality paradox, we have this long-standing debate in the field about the basis of these observations. And they're important pieces of the puzzle, like migrant health selection, variation across immigrant cohorts, variation across immigrant generation, and even patterns of return migration. All of these are going to be pieces of the puzzle that would help us understand this. And here I just list 5 relevant streams of literature that often draw on vital statistics data. So in addition to what I just mentioned, the immigrant birth weight paradox, the health impacts of immigration enforcement, and also looking at migrant mortality in response to migration deterrence practices. So my mortality data has been used to better understand heterogeneity among immigrants to document disparities. Some of this work uses just straight mortality, others uses survey-linked mortality data, which I won't focus on so much today because you really get that from the survey sources, so I'm focusing more on government sources of mortality and birth data. And there's an increasing appreciation of just how important migration experiences and immigration policies are for health, really thinking about these as perhaps one of the most fundamental social determinants of health. In fact, restrictive immigration policy and immigrant exclusion practices are becoming one of the key bases of evidence for how structural racism and discrimination can impact health in the short term. So a lot of the kind of cutting edge work and theorizing around structural racism and health inequity reaches and looks to immigration enforcement as its contextual example. And I really think that this is the kind of health research that is most urgently needed. I find it, most urgent and necessary. This kind of research that uses health data, so it doesn't just focus on health as the end, but that uses health data to reveal hidden social structures and practices. And the analogy that I like to use is as if you walk into a room and it looks empty, but there's actually an invisible table there, and the health data is like throwing an invisible tablecloth and draping it over this invisible table. All of a sudden you can see how tall it is, how long it is, how wide it is. So health data can allow us to reveal social structures that matter, such as the racialization of immigrants, looking at this in intersectional ways, looking at variation across contexts of reception. As I mentioned, consequences of legal violence and consequences of a changing political climate for immigrants, and also the unequal health burdens that may be concentrated among particular immigrant communities. So I want to take one more steps to make this even more tangible. And so here I just list 3 possible example research questions that one might ask that would draw on either birth data or death data. And I just organized these between 3 distinct methodological approaches that are often used with vital statistics data. So a lot of descriptive work, which I think is so important. Also, you can use it with time series and kind of quasi-experimental time series analyses. And then, of course, causal inference with regression modeling. So one might ask, how did the magnitude of immigrant versus non-immigrant disparities in COVID deaths among working people, how does the magnitude of these disparities vary according to some county level variable like social vulnerability index? Or one might ask, how did the El Paso massacre impact rates of adverse birth outcomes among Latinx immigrant mothers? And how far out are those effects seen in terms of surrounding counties? Or one might ask, does county level immigration enforcement intensity increase risk of adverse birth outcomes among immigrant mothers? Okay, so let's back up and talk about vital statistics. Let's talk about the actual data. So what are vital statistics? They are numerical data on births, deaths, marriages, divorces, and fetal deaths. And for the purposes of this talk, let's focus only on the birth data and the death data. And this data comes from birth certificates and death certificates. It is then collected and kept at both local, state, and national levels, or local kind of, depending on if there is a jurisdiction below state, and national levels. And so the key point here that I want you to take away here from this slide is that this is not a sample. This data includes the entire population of individuals who had a birth certificate or a death certificate in that year. And the key variable that unlocks this as a data source that can be used by migration researchers is country of birth. I want to distinguish between 2 forms of vital statistics data. We can have microdata or aggregate data. And these are really just formats. Obviously, it all starts with individuals, but the data, it can be released in a microdata format where each row is an individual birth or an individual death. Or it can be released in an aggregate format where each row is a population subgroup of varying specificity. So maybe one of the rows would be non-Latinx Black women aged 60 to 64, decedents, people who died. And much of the publicly available data is released in this aggregate format. Another difference from other data that you may have worked with is that we often define outcomes at the population level as opposed to at the individual level. And so you've heard of mortality rates. That's an example of a population level outcome. And a mortality rate is going to require two inputs, right? Because you need the number of people who died, and you're going to divide that basically to kind of standardize it by the number of people in the population who could have died. And in order to get to a rate, you'll need data on both the numerator and the denominator. And so you'll merge two sources of data. Often they're released together, but it's important to realize that you're getting numerator data and denominator data. Generally, it'll be annual. And with the restricted data, you actually can get not just the time period, but the specific date of death or of birth, and that can be used to aggregate to months or even to weeks if you want. Especially for an analysis that focuses on comparisons of death rates, so any kind of population outcome, it's going to be necessary to plan ahead. So you're going to need to plan your analysis ahead of time, because you'll need to make decisions about how to organize the subgroups that you're going to compare, because this is going to shape how your data is structured. So there are different options around how race is counted. So you'll need to think about which racial ethnic categories you want to use. For mortality data, you'll need to think about how, what size of an age group you want to use. Do you want a 1-year age bin or a 5-year age bin? And then you can compare data using for the death data with age-specific rates, or you can compare total populations with a process called age standardization. And this is basically just a very simple reweighting technique that we use when we're comparing two populations, and we want to minimize any kind of differences in the age composition of those two subgroups or two populations. Okay, so the National Vital Statistics System is the main, most comprehensive source of mortality data. And if you take nothing else away from my talk, it's this, that really to do migration research, you will need to apply for the restricted data. But you can do this, and it's not like a FOIA request. You will get the data in a shorter period of time. But to do migration research, you're going to need the restricted data, because that's how you're going to get country of birth or country of death. And this just gives you a sense of how this data is kept at both the national level in the Center for Vital Statistics, or the National Center for Health Statistics, and it's kept at state and local levels. And I just wanted to give you an example that, these sources are all going to come from the same National Center for Health Statistics, whether you want birth data or death data. But for local data, it really is going to depend, and it really varies across states and localities. So some local health departments, like Los Angeles or like New York City, they will give you can apply for restricted live birth data from them, for example, or you can apply for restricted mortality data from the California Department of Public Health. But the New York State Department of Public Health isn't going to give you that restricted data. So it really varies. And then just remember, we have a denominator here. So your source of population estimates, you can just use what you get with the data that's released to you, like the death data that you get, or you can draw on two different sources of census data, the population estimates program estimates, which tend to be better aligned with the vital statistics data, or you can draw on American Community Survey data, ACS, which I often get from the IPM's website. But the census website is a great resource for learning about all the details of this side of it. They have great webinars and resources to coach you in how to merge in by a county identifier, by race, by ethnicity, and by year. So in general, vital statistics have some important advantages. It's not a sample, and this allows us to reach hard to reach population subgroups that may not be captured in survey data. We overcome a lot of the selection bias due to lack of health insurance and healthcare access. And we get access to data on not just whether someone's foreign born, but their specific country of birth. Of course, some of the limitations are that one really needs restricted access to the data. There are a lot of inaccuracies and misclassifications in the death data, and there can be time lags in the reporting, especially for deaths, where it takes several months, and even for certain causes of death like poisoning, even longer. One other thing is that individuals are treated as independent observations in this data, so you can't easily study families or households or communities. Okay, so getting the data is generally going to require a special application. And I also want to say that beyond this, there are ways that the best data may require a special relationship. And what I mean by that is that there are teams of researchers, both inside health departments and working with health departments, that are using a lot of the data at the state level. And so I'm a part of one of those that's based at Santa Cruz and at UCSF. And we have a special data use agreement with the state of California. And some of my colleagues have similar arrangements set up, for example, in Minnesota. And often local health departments will partner with academics to do this. And so you as grad students or other scholars interested in this should and can reach out to those teams to try to support that work and get access to the data in that way. This is a good strategy for trying to get access to some of the variables that wouldn't be released even in the restricted data, such as social security number and other identifying information like names or actual specific addresses where people died. I'm going to give you the link to this is the main site where you can go to request either the birth data or the mortality data. And one thing I want to note is, in some ways I should have done, this is a little out of order because like I said, you want to plan your analysis carefully before you apply, and that you'll need a separate application for each project. One other thing I want to point out, do you see this first line here, that they won't consider requests that do not involve an evaluation of health or factors related to health? So you'll want to think ahead of time of how to frame your inquiry to show how the implications of your research, that it may have implications for learning about health. That's a key requirement to gaining access to this data, but it can be used pretty broadly in terms of what I've seen. And you can apply as a team and list your other co-investigators on this, or you can ask, like if someone else is using this data, if you can be added to their application the next time they reapply. Okay, so I have about, let's see, I'll take like about 6 more minutes to go through some examples with the birth certificate data and the death certificate data. So let's do a deeper dive on birth certificate data first. There's just really growing powerful evidence that birth outcomes are sensitive to the macro political context. And the mechanisms are still being explored, but there's evidence that stress and economic insecurity and different forms of discrimination increase risk of low birth weight and preterm babies. One of the more compelling examples of this comes from the study of the major post-Phil immigration raid in Iowa, and the effects of that raid on low birth weight and preterm births among Latina mothers in the state of Iowa in the year following that raid. That was by Nicole Novak and colleagues. So restricted data, this is just going to kind of give you a sense of the variables of interest from birth certificates and the difference between what's available in the data that you can just download from the website right now, the public data, and the restricted data. So since 2005, country of birth has not been included in the public data. If you're doing anything more historical, you can get it. But in the more recent years, you would need to apply for the restricted data. I forgot to mention that those applications generally are considered in 4 to 6 weeks. I haven't heard of it lasting, they're usually pretty quick. In the times that I've gotten it, it was definitely less than 3 months to once you email your application to have the data delivered to you. And so in the restricted data, we get mother's country of birth and we get date of birth. And so it allows us to think about kind of these intergenerational impacts. And birth outcomes are really, these would be the variables that we might look at as an outcome. So you could look at it at a population level in terms of differences in rates, or you could look at it at the individual level with low birth weight, preterm birth, the actual measure of birth weight, the actual gestational age, APGAR score. There's several outcomes, but these might be the ones that would be useful. And I'll just give you an example of how I've used this. In a study, we wanted to understand how state policy partisanship may impact birth outcomes. And so we compared, you can see how state policy partisanship has really increased. The partisanship of state policies, the clustering of state policies on kind of right and left ends of the spectrum has increased in recent years. And so we looked at this and we asked, does the association between state policy orientation, right or left, does it impact birth outcomes, and does it do so in a way that differs by the mother's nativity, whether she's foreign born or not? And so we looked at policies from all these different domains. And one of the powerful things about birth data is that you can merge in other data, other kinds of policy data, other kinds of administrative data. You can merge it in at an aggregate level, either at the county level or at the state level. So here we merged in policy data at the state level. And we found that babies born in left-leaning states on average, have better birth outcomes than babies born in right-leaning states. But this protective association is stronger for US-born mothers. It doesn't seem that foreign-born mothers enjoy the same protective association of left-leaning policies. So that, it kind of gives you an example of what you can do, the kinds of stories that you can tell when you merge policy data to birth outcome data. I think I've covered a lot of the strengths and limitations. One of the strengths here is that birth data really describes a meaningful cohort. That's a difference between this and the death data. I will admit that it can be hard to wrangle. That's both a strength and a limitation because we're talking about really, really large N's. As you can see here, if I go back, 56 million births when we kind of pooled together over all those years. The other thing is that it doesn't clarify anything about the mechanisms between, the policy impact and the birth outcome. Okay, so similar, nothing really new here. Death certificates, they contain a lot of information about the decedent. It's filled out by a funeral home director in most cases, and so that's where a lot of the misclassification can come in, and that would impact everything from race, ethnicity, to an occupation specification, to cause of death. So that's an important kind of pitfall to know. The other thing I'll mention is that death certificates also contain the social security number, the exact address of residence, the exact address of the place of death, and the actual name of people, but usually that more detailed identifiable information isn't shared without a special request. And so if you really wanted to use social security numbers, I would encourage you to, well, one, you can reach out to me and maybe target like the California Department of Public Health and ask them for access to the death certificate data with social security numbers and explain why you need it. There are a lot of really interesting ways to use death data to study all-cause mortality or cause-specific mortality, or what's called excess mortality, where we compare what the normal level of death is in a normal year to what we might see, for example, during the pandemic. And one of the powerful things about this approach is that we can really overcome biases that would emerge from immigrant people not having access to, for example, COVID testing. So there are a lot of ways that even the COVID-specific death rates that show that immigrants have been harder hit by COVID are surely an underestimate, because in order to die of COVID, you have to have been tested for COVID. And so we've been showing that with the excess death, looking at excess mortality, you can tell a more powerful story about differences between by country of origin and as it intersects with other things. So actually, let me get into that and show you that. Okay, so here's a second example. In this example, I worked with death certificate data just from California, and we limited the analysis to only look at working age Latino Californians. And we looked at disparities in excess death, so the level of death during the pandemic compared to what it should have been had there been no pandemic. And we looked at foreign-born versus US-born, essential versus non-essential job holders, and education. And we also looked at this in more detail, and we were able to show that, for example, excess death was highest among immigrants from Guatemala, followed by Mexico. So there are even nuances among Latino immigrants that are really important that you can see when you look at country of origin. So what we found is that the mortality disadvantages associated with being an essential worker that we've kind of all begun to hear about are actually made worse by being foreign born and having less than a high school education. And these things compound such that it's foreign born essential workers without a high school education that experienced basically a 60% increase in death during just the first 7 months of the pandemic. I want to just show you one thing here. Prior to our study, Latinos were generally treated as a single group in most studies of COVID death, and that's because of the limitations of surveillance data. Death certificate data allows us to tell a more nuanced story because we can bring in low formal schooling, we can focus on occupational differences, and we can bring in nuance around country of birth. And this is what we could measure with the data we have. But of course, there's still other limitations there, and there's so much more that isn't captured in the death certificate, like language, like indigeneity, that you might have to do more guesswork around. So different data tell different stories. And I'll just wrap up to kind of summarize with some takeaways for you. So do request restricted data and do bring in a health research angle. That's going to be your key to getting access to this data, but don't be intimidated by this. It's very easy to request and get the restricted data. Do ask for help and work with others, especially in kind of the subfield of quantitative demographers and social epidemiologists. There's a real culture of sharing code, either published or through email. So you can often borrow code from other people that will help you kind of leap ahead in cleaning the data and learning how to work with it. So do plan your subgroup comparisons ahead of time. Really think about how you can merge in other sources of contextual data that's probably going to be at the county level. Maybe you're going to merge in some TRAC data at the state or county level. And I really encourage you to lean into descriptive analysis and time series analysis for these population level outcomes. And one other warning is to think carefully about the timing of plausible effects. So one of the advantages of the birth data is that it's plausible that we could detect effects of, for example, the SB 1070, a change in immigration policy in the short term. But it would be much harder to really see and point to the effects of that in the death data, unless you are really careful. What might show that? What cause of death might show that in the short term? Would it be strokes? Would it be overdoses? So this is where you want to be really clear and think about the timing of plausible effects. Okay, and then this is my last slide. There's just so many exciting directions to take this work. Thinking about how we can use birth data to show the potential to buffer the harmful effects of immigration enforcement. Do sanctuary policies protect birth outcomes from these other harmful effects that have been documented? What will be the consequences of the COVID pandemic for the Latino mortality paradox? Is it being eroded? We need people to be thinking about this. And I think a lot of what's going to be exciting will happen through cross-national data linkages around vital statistics and linking this data to survey data and other administrative data. Okay. Sorry if I went over a little. Thank you.
No, not at all. Okay, so thank you so much to Austin, to Caitlin, and to Alicia for 3 absolutely fantastic and very deeply informative presentations. So much material for everyone to ponder and to think about how to exploit in order to shed insight on so many different and fascinating phenomena. So we can proceed if people have questions to raise your hand or to send me a message in the chat, and I can read it out to the panelists. Anybody want to begin the discussion? Joseph Nwadiuko. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Joseph Nwadiuko. I'm at UCLA. Thanks so much for these really great deep dives into your experience. I was wondering if you guys can speak a little bit about, and I know that Austin and Caitlin, you spoke about this briefly, but Alicia, you might have something to add as well, about the importance of validation. And how exactly that is carried out in a real-time status. You know, does that involve data sharing across teams? Does that, like what exactly, if you can just, I know you referenced it, but if you can speak a little more detail as to how validation can be done and once you get government data or have access to public government data.
Who wants to respond?
I'll go first because I have less to say. You know, I think that there's a lot of ways that we know that death certificate data falls short in terms of Hispanic ethnicity, and there are tools that you can use to kind of reweight that. But for the most part, I guess I defer to experts like Elizabeth Arias and folks who are in the Center for National Vital Statistics Surveillance, and those who are I do kind of trust a lot of the reweighting that they're doing. What I will say on the death certificates that's interesting is that these things are consequential, and the misclassification of death, it's like we know about it, and so you have to just kind of embrace it as a limitation of using the data. But for example, it's consequential in that for COVID deaths, we know that there are state and local differences and many of them have a political basis in how a death would be classified as a COVID death or not. And this is consequential because in order to get FEMA assistance, funeral assistance, the person who the decedent has to have died of COVID. And so we can show systematically in the data that there are systematic differences at the state level, and they may actually persist. I actually haven't looked at it yet by foreign birth or not. But there are disadvantages in terms of that you're not getting a more accurate cause of death. So if you don't have as good of access to a healthcare provider, if you die in your home and they call up your physician and they say, okay, we need a cause of death for this person. If the last thing you were treated for was diabetes or was for cancer, often that will be put as the cause of death on the death certificate, when maybe it was a COVID death that never was tested. And so there are consequences even for the ability for people to access other kinds of benefits that come from this misclassification of causes.
Okay, thank you.
I mentioned this, so thank you for that question. I think in particular when we're talking about data acquired through the Freedom of Information Act from agencies that are not interested in releasing the data in a systematic way, or at least weren't designed to do so. It's a really important and difficult question, and one that I've struggled with a lot. So I mentioned one thing that I tried to do to at least validate the content of the records. So in theory, when I requested the records on administrative segregation, I was provided the universe of records, so almost the population, if you will, right, of records. But that's only as good as what ICE defines as a placement into solitary confinement, meeting that the definition that they put in place. And as I showed already just in my findings, there's so much variation at the local level. It's likely, if not a fact, that there will also be maybe discrepancies in what they're actually classifying. So that aside, What I did do, as I mentioned, was merge the FOIA records that I had received with records that a journalist had received, and also someone in a government watchdog agency, and we did find a one-to-one match there. So as I said earlier, if there's any missing data, it's missing consistently. Then the other problem is what the agencies will release under any given FOIA request. So I mentioned that we merged in the national analysis and also in the state level analysis, but merged with data from TRAC. That data was, for example, aggregate, average characteristics of a detained population in a given time period that did not match one-to-one in the time period that I was interested in. So I can't say, because there literally is no data, I cannot say that is an actual match for the entire time that I was looking at. Sometimes, for example, a facility will open or close in a given period, and things like that. So that's a really important point, and it's really difficult to know, the extent to which what I found in my research is actually true overall. But really important point. So I just say, I don't know if Austin has thoughts on that in terms of how TRAC does it, but for me, that was a big issue with the analysis.
Okay, thank you. Regina Jeffries, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. And thanks everyone for putting on this event. This has been fantastic. I want to sort of build on the question that was just asked. And I think Austin and Caitlin both spoke to aspects of this, but to what degree have participants requested information on how data are collected and maintained by agency officials? I know Austin mentioned how TRAC has had to mitigate problems with data reliability, fit, sufficiency, those types of things coming particularly from EOIR and during the Trump administration. But I'm just wondering if people have strategies for contextualizing data collection in this way. So in other words, not just cleaning the data and mitigating problems, but actually treating the need to address unreliable data as a research problem in itself. So I wondered if anyone had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and also connect a little bit to the last question. It's a great question, Regina. So when you're going after government databases, government data sets of any kind, there's a couple pieces, there's like a couple pillars of information here. And this is, I'm sort of describing in general principles. This is just kind of true across all these data sets. You can request what are called code books. So any data set that's out there is or should have a list of codes that's used in that database and what each of those codes mean. That's something that over time through litigation and FOIA requests TRAC has obtained. It's something that we tend to do very early on in the process so that we can understand what's there. The better that you can understand what's in the databases, the better you can structure your FOIA request to do that. We don't start off, our very first FOIA request asking for everything. And so you've got the data, you've got the code books, and then you also have the structure of the databases. So, when you build a database, it's not like people who do this for a living, Oracle and so forth, who sell databases and database management software to the government. They're designing through the contract that they have with the federal government, they're designing this database. Well, guess what? There's actually, database maps out there that are government records you can ask for. So in some cases, you can get that data either through FOIA requests or through litigation. And that helps you to kind of map out how the database is organized. And it allows you to understand what you can even ask for. Because when, this is just, for everyone in the room to really understand that at a general, like just a fundamental level, when the government is pulling records for you, they're writing code. They're not walking into a room pulling out files unless you're requesting paper files. They're writing code that is in a database programming language to pull data, not just from like one Excel sheet, but from a whole bunch of different databases, which requires a particular kind of search format. So the better that you can understand what can be pulled together, the more successful and more, frankly, more interesting data you can ask for. So that's really important. And to the point, I think this ties in very, very centrally to the last question, which is how do you know that you're getting the right stuff? Well, it's kind of like sonar, or it's kind of like GPS. Your GPS on your phone doesn't work because there's one satellite. There's 5 satellites that are all understand that they have a certain radius of connection. And the more satellites you have that can overlay the information they have about your location, the more precisely and confidently they can do that. So what do? We send not just one FOIA request for something, we send multiple, and we ask for it in different ways. And then we sort of piece it together internally. Okay, we understand how this works. This is valid. We do some internal validation. So just like if you look at the data over time, you get really familiar with, here's just a really simple thing. There's never going to be fewer cases in the immigration court database than there was the month before. You're never going to have 100 immigration cases one month in the total database and then have fewer. You're always going to have more because you can't undo past immigration cases. So a very simple sum check that we do on a lot of things is just like, did the records increase from request to request? If they if they decreased, well, you've got an issue, that kind of thing. And then of course we just compare it to other things the government has written publicly. If they say they've deported 250,000 people in a year, can we reproduce their statistics using granular data that they pull from the database? That's kind of, hopefully that gets at the question.
Okay, Alicia, Caitlin, do you want to respond further, or should we move to the next question? Okay, then we have a question in the chat from David Fitzgerald, which is directed to Austin. So what are the prospects for being able to distinguish between border apprehension events and individuals apprehended in a given year?
Yeah, great question. This one's relatively straightforward, although it's not, we have the data on this because we run into this in the immigration court data too. So the way that Department of Homeland Security keeps data in those databases I showed you, there's a couple different ways that they store data, and they don't always have all of the individualizing data for each person, or in the past they haven't, that would allow you to track this data across time. So let's just have like an abstract hypothetical. Let's say someone tries to cross the border. They're encountered by Border Patrol, and Border Patrol just returns them, just walks them back across the border. They're going to collect some amount of information, maybe on paper, maybe on a computer now, I don't know. And it's going to go into a database. The question is, how much data do they have on that in that particular encounter that would allow them to track that person if a week from now, that same person comes back and tries to cross the border? Now you have 2 events. Is there a unique identifier, or is there some uniquely identifying information that allows you to sort of connect those two to get at what you're saying, the difference between number of times Border Patrol has come into contact with someone versus how many people? So we know we're starting to get some more data from Border Patrol. Well, spoiler alert, we actually are. We just released our first report on CBP this week on inadmissible encounters. So we're very excited about that. But we're still in the process of trying to sort this out. The problem is simple to understand, but figuring out if we can do it with CBP is a bit of an issue. So it's a great question. I don't have an answer in terms of the data, but that's how we approach it. And as you point out, David, this is a really important thing to distinguish, because unfortunately there's been a lot of misinformation about people representing encounters as people. In the story, in the hypothetical I just gave, that's 1 person, 2 encounters. If that ends up holding true across the board for 100,000 people, you can represent that as 200,000 encounters. That's a lot higher than you only actually encountered 100,000 people. And there's been a lot of misinformation about sort of misrepresenting encounters as people. So it is something that we want to add better clarity on. Thanks for the question.
Okay, terrific. Other
Another hand.
questions from the audience? Or have we exhausted everyone's concentration? It is Friday afternoon. Okay, from Sharon to FOIA. Any advice for partnering or connecting with legal experts as you build your network or research team? I guess that's a question for all three of our panelists.
Sharon, thank you for that question. I think that's a really important question, and it's something that I have found incredibly valuable in the work that I've done. And not just legal experts, but people working on the ground in communities that are impacted by these issues. And a lot of times, various people are working together. So legal experts are working with community organizers who are working with advocates, who are working with academics. And for me, those are the most fruitful collaborations. I think it's important to reach out. So when you say legal experts, maybe you could clarify who you mean here, but yeah, maybe could you clarify?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Caitlin. So it's mostly like thinking of as I develop a research question and how I would approach potentially court proceeding documents and like what things I want to look at. And so where to kind of get legal guidance or legal advice. Here at UC Merced, we don't have a law school. And as you know, the region is kind of limited as far as legal resources. And so it came to mind in you describing your work of like, oh, always consult like an attorney.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, well, those are kind of limited around here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That's a really important point, and especially because I think the Central Valley is where so much of the immigration enforcement actions have moved over the past few years. I'm not sure they're still on the call, but there was I'm just gonna give a little shout out to Pablo, who's here on the call from California Collaborative for Immigrant Justice. They're doing statewide work, really important work, litigation, advocacy, networking, strategy. They're terrific, and they are doing work in the Central Valley, and so yeah, there's a little clap. So maybe you two can chat offline and have a conversation about that. And I think legal experts, would come in all shapes and sizes and would be able to help. Non-lawyers, would also be able to help you even just kind of think about what, as you said it, how to develop the actual research question. And so that's just one organization, but they're kind of linking all kinds of organizations across the state and could potentially put you in touch with the right people to have some conversations.
Someone else?
I'll just add quickly if maybe this won't answer it for you, Sharon, but if anyone else is interested in health outcomes, what I've found useful is often I get the timing wrong, especially if you're trying to evaluate like a shift in policy and you're trying to show the consequences of that shift in policy and birth outcomes. And so a colleague that I've been using as a resource is at the Immigrant Defense Project, and partnering with kind of a legal advocacy organization like that really both understands the timing of policy changes and the ground truth of how, in response to each policy change, there's kind of like, or kind of a protective policy change, there's a backlash, can help understand why we might see null effects in the health outcomes data, and really can help you frame it appropriately before you publish it and before it's picked up by a media audience.
Okay, a question from Orlando Lara. I'm wondering if any of you have tips for making FOIA requests for other government agencies. I'm working on FOIA requests with the DOS, for example. Are there communities of researchers organized around agencies, or some tips and practices that might apply across some agencies?
That's a great question. Can you, Orlando, would you be able to specify a little bit more about the theme of the data that you're going after? Is it immigration related of some kind?
Yeah, I'm looking at passport data, passport denial data, specifically with the Department of State.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I did a project last year that was kind of mapping the FOIA community, because there are sort of like professional practice communities around different themes and agencies. Kind of interesting to see like the sociology of these social groups. Just one thing, Department of State has the longest response time of any agency by far. So this is going to be a multi-year project to get anything back. And if you're trying to get comprehensive data, again, it's going to be very difficult to get that without litigating, litigating the case probably. But again, to Caitlin's point earlier, I would definitely recommend finding other people who have done similar work. I don't think it's been mentioned, but muckrock.com or org, I'll just put this in the chat, is a really great place where you can see other FOIA requests that other people have sent. You can see who sent them and what their responses are and what agencies they sent them to. So I would suggest, I am not at all familiar with data around what you're looking for, but if you find someone else, you might find someone on there who's done it, and you might have a one-on-one.
Okay.
There you go. Regina's done it. Reach out to Regina.
Okay. So yes, Regina has responded in the chat. Okay. So if there are no further questions, why don't we bring the session to an end? So thanks again to Austin, to Caitlin, to Alicia for 3 fantastic, very, very rich presentations. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Yes, let's applaud the speakers. I want to remind you that CCIS and CSIM have one last session planned for this quarter. 2 weeks from now, June 3rd, a discussion of a very interesting new book by Adrian Favell. Okay, so until then, have a good weekend, everyone. Thanks again to the speakers, and looking forward to seeing you one last time on June 3rd. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.